Mr. Volkov, please will you walk me to school today?
When 8-year-old Zara Williams knocked on Dante Volkov's office door at 7:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning and asked the most feared man in Chicago to walk her to school because the boys who'd been following her were getting braver, he did something no one in his organization had ever seen him do. He said yes. Not because he was soft, not because it was good for business, but because this child, daughter of the woman who cleaned his blood off marble floors without asking questions, had looked at him with eyes that reminded him of someone he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. And what started as a single walk to protect one terrified child would end with Dante Volkov doing something that would shock his enemies, confuse his allies, and prove that even men built from violence could choose something different when given a reason that mattered. Dante Volkov was 43 years old and had built the Volkov crime family into the most feared organization in Chicago through calculated violence, enforcement that left messages written in broken bones, and a reputation for being utterly ruthless that kept rivals terrified and allies obedient. He had no family, no children, no softness ever shown publicly in the 25 years he'd spent constructing an empire on the foundation of other people's fear. But in his wallet, hidden behind credit cards and cash soaked in blood money, he carried a photograph so worn the edges had turned soft from being touched by hands that killed for a living. Katya Volkov, his younger sister. Dead at 8 years old when Dante was 18, killed by a rival gang as retaliation for Dante's early territorial ambitions. Her small body left on their mother's doorstep as a message that would echo through the next quarter century of Dante's life. He'd spent those 25 years becoming exactly what had killed her, a man people feared so completely that no one would ever dare take from him again. But he never spoke Katya's name, never acknowledged her existence, just carried her photo like a wound that wouldn't heal, and used the pain to fuel an empire built on making sure he was always the most dangerous thing in any room. Isabel Williams had been cleaning Dante's properties for 3 years. 32 years old, single black mother raising her daughter Zara alone in a neighborhood where safety was a luxury she couldn't afford, and violence was background noise she'd learned to navigate with the skill of someone who had no other choice. She cleaned Dante's penthouse, his office building, and occasionally the crime scenes his business created, scrubbing blood off marble floors without asking questions because discretion paid better than curiosity. And her daughter needed food, needed school supplies, needed a future that didn't look like the present Isabel was trapped inside. Sometimes, when after-school care fell through or money was too tight to pay for supervision, Zara waited in Dante's office building, lobby, doing homework on leather couches worth more than Isabel's annual salary. A small black girl surrounded by men who carried guns under expensive suits and never looked at her because Dante Volkov's policy was absolute. No innocents involved, no children touched by the business, no exceptions. That Thursday morning, everything changed because fear makes children brave in ways adults have forgotten how to be. Zara had begged her mother to call in sick, to stay home, to not make her walk to school through streets that had stopped feeling safe 3 weeks ago when the teenage boys started following her route. First, just watching. Then catcalling, then getting closer, their threats escalating from words to touches that made Zara's 8-year-old body freeze with terror her mother couldn't protect her from, because Isabel couldn't miss work, couldn't afford to lose this job, couldn't move them somewhere safer, because safety cost money they didn't have. So Zara made a choice that only desperate children understand. She walked past her mother scrubbing floors in the executive suite, past Dante's second-in-command Nikolai, who barely glanced at her, and knocked on the door of the most dangerous man she'd ever seen. The man her mother called Mr. Volkov in a voice that carried respect and fear in equal measure. The man whose office she'd waited in dozens of times while men with cold eyes discussed things in Russian she didn't understand but recognized as threats. Dante looked up from contracts that outlined territory disputes and shipment routes, saw this child standing in his doorway with her backpack and her braided hair, and her eyes that were trying so hard to be brave, while terror made her small hands shake, and said what he always said to interruptions. "What?" Zara's voice came out smaller than she'd planned, but she forced the words through fear that wanted to steal her courage. Mr. Volkov, there are boys who follow me to school. They're getting braver. My mama can't walk me because she works for you. Can you walk me instead? Just until they stop. Please." The silence that followed felt like the entire building holding its breath. Dante's men exchanged glances that said this child had just made a request that crossed every line their boss had drawn between his business and anything resembling human softness. But Dante looked at Zara Williams, 8 years old, asking the most feared man in Chicago for protection, and saw Katya's face. Same age, same fear, same vulnerability that the world fed on, because the world was built by men like him who turned children into casualties and called it the cost of power. Before we continue, if you believe even the most dangerous among us can choose protection over destruction, when someone small enough asks, subscribe to Love is Kindness. Now tell us, have you ever asked someone unexpected for help and discovered they were exactly who you needed? Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Dante's men exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations without words, all of them expecting their boss to refuse this absurd request or delegate it to someone expendable. Send one of the lower-level enforcers to intimidate some teenagers and call it handled. But Dante stood up from his desk, this man who'd built an empire on being unmoved by anything resembling human vulnerability, and looked at Zara Williams with her backpack decorated with cartoon characters and her eyes trying so hard to be brave, and saw Katya's face superimposed over this child's features like a ghost that had been waiting 25 years to make him answer for becoming the thing that had killed her. Same age, same fear, same vulnerability the world preyed on because the world was built by men like him who fed on the defenseless and called it survival. "Get your backpack," Dante said, his voice leaving no room for argument or interpretation. "I'll walk you." Nikolai, his second-in-command for 15 years, a man who'd helped Dante build this empire through strategic brutality and calculated violence, stepped forward with objection written across features that rarely showed anything except cold efficiency. "Boss, this isn't," he started, but Dante cut him off with a look that had ended conversations and occasionally ended lives. "I said I'll walk her." The office went silent. Men who negotiated territory disputes and planned enforcement operations and moved millions in illegal revenue watched their untouchable boss put on his coat to walk an 8-year-old black girl to elementary school like he was her father instead of the man her mother cleaned blood for. They walked 6 blocks through Chicago's streets where Dante's reputation preceded him like a weapon he didn't need to draw. Just the sight of him in his $1,000 suit with his cold eyes and his presence that radiated danger, making people cross to the other side of the street without conscious thought. Zara barely reached his waist, her small hand occasionally brushing his as they navigated sidewalks crowded with people who saw Dante Volkov and suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Silence stretched between them for the first 3 blocks, Dante not knowing how to talk to children, and Zara working up courage to speak to a man everyone treated like a natural disaster given human form. "My mama says you're important," Zara finally said, her voice carrying that particular honesty children have before life teaches them useful lies. Dante's response was automatic, honed by years of Isabel's perfect discretion. "Your mama is discreet." Zara considered this, her 8-year-old mind translating adult euphemisms with uncomfortable accuracy. "She means scary, but I think scary is just lonely wearing a mask." Dante stopped walking so abruptly that Zara took 2 more steps before realizing he'd frozen on the sidewalk, staring at her with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been recognition if he'd allowed himself to feel things that deeply anymore. "Who taught you that?" he asked, his voice rough around edges that usually stayed smooth and controlled. "Nobody," Zara replied, meeting his eyes without the fear most adults couldn't suppress. "I just think it's true." The pattern established itself with the inevitability of gravity. The teenage boys who'd been following Zara saw Dante Volkov walking beside her that first morning and disappeared like smoke in wind, their bravery evaporating the second they recognized who'd claimed protection over their intended victim. Word spread through Chicago's criminal networks with the speed of profitable gossip. "Volkov is walking the black kid to school." His enemies were confused, analyzing the move for strategic advantage they couldn't identify. His allies were nervous, wondering if their boss was showing weakness that could be exploited, or playing some game too complex for them to understand yet. But Dante showed up every morning at 7:45 a.m. sharp, punctual as death and just as inevitable, waiting in his office lobby for Zara to arrive with her backpack and her braids, and her willingness to treat him like he was human, instead of the monster he'd spent decades becoming. Day 2 brought questions about the scar on his right hand, the one that stretched from his thumb to his wrist in a line too straight to be accidental, too deliberate to be anything except violence survived. "Knife fight when I was young," Dante said, giving her the sanitized version that didn't include details about the man whose throat he'd cut after taking that wound. "Did you win?" Zara asked with the pragmatism children apply to violence they don't fully understand yet. "I survived," Dante replied, the distinction automatic after 25 years of understanding the difference. Not always the same thing. Zara went quiet for half a block, processing this, then delivered her verdict with the certainty only 8-year-olds possess. "That's sad." It was the first time in Dante's adult life that anyone had called his survival sad instead of impressive, had looked at his ability to stay alive through violence and seen loss instead of victory. Day 3, Zara brought him a drawing, crayon on construction paper, crude and beautiful the way children's art is before they learn to be self-conscious about imperfection. "This is you protecting me," she explained, pointing to a large figure colored in black and gray, standing between a small brown figure and abstract shapes that might have been threats or might have been her 8-year-old attempt at rendering teenage boys who followed girls to school. "See? You're like a dragon." Dante Volkov, a man who'd killed people with his bare hands, who'd built an empire on making other criminals afraid, who hadn't felt uncertain about anything in decades, didn't know what to do with a child's drawing that cast him as mythical protector instead of the predator he actually was. He kept it, folded it, carefully, and placed it in his suit pocket like it was a contract worth millions instead of crayon and construction paper, and the first gift anyone had given him in years that didn't come with strings attached or ulterior motives hidden behind flattery. Day 4 brought stories about school, the teacher who was mean about late homework, the friend who shared her lunch when Zara forgot hers, the spelling test she'd studied for and still only gotten a B on because English was hard and some words didn't follow the rules they were supposed to follow. Dante realized, walking through his territory listening to an 8-year-old's mundane concerns, that no one had talked to him about normal things in decades. Everything was business, territory disputes, threat assessment, revenue streams, and enforcement strategies, in which rival needed to be reminded why cooperation was preferable to conflict. This child treated him like he was human, like he was someone who might care about spelling tests and mean teachers and the social dynamics of 3rd grade, and something in Dante's chest that he'd thought was dead started to ache. Day 5 brought the question he should have expected, but somehow hadn't prepared for. "Do you have kids?" Zara asked with the directness children employ before learning that some questions hurt. "No," Dante said, the single syllable carrying 25 years of deliberate isolation. "Why not?" Zara pressed, her young voice genuinely curious. "You'd be good at it." Dante's laugh came out rough, almost painful, like something rusted trying to move after years of being frozen. "I'm not good at anything except being dangerous." Zara stopped walking, turned to look up at him with those eyes that saw too much, and delivered her verdict with the authority 8-year-olds possess when they're absolutely certain they're right. "That's not true. You're good at showing up. That's the hardest part." Week 2 brought the shift from routine to something deeper, something that would force Dante to confront exactly what he was doing and why. He'd started picking Zara up after school, a new routine that emerged without discussion, Dante simply appearing at 3:15 p.m. outside her elementary school, like he had nothing better to do than escort an 8-year-old home. That Tuesday, he found her crying on the front steps, blood dried under her nose, her uniform shirt torn at the collar. The rage that hit him was immediate and volcanic, the kind that had made his reputation, the kind that ended in broken bodies and messages delivered through violence. But before he could move, before he could demand names and addresses and start planning retribution, Zara grabbed his hand with her small fingers and stopped him with words that cut deeper than any knife. "Don't hurt him. He's just scared like everybody else." Dante knelt down on concrete still warm from afternoon sun, bringing himself to her eye level, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "He hurt you. And you walking me to school hurt his dad's business," Zara replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious facts. "My mama heard. His dad works for someone you hurt. So he hurt me." It's a circle. 8-year-old philosophy breaking down cycles of violence that Dante had spent 25 years perpetuating without questioning, without considering that maybe the blood he spilled found ways to splash onto innocence he'd convinced himself his policy protected. Dante stared at this child who understood his world better than most adults, who could trace cause and effect through violence's ripples the way he traced revenue through shell companies, and realized he'd been lying to himself about what protection actually meant. Day 10 brought the moment that shattered everything Dante had built between himself and the grief that had made him. They walked their usual route, 6 blocks through territory Dante controlled through fear and strategic brutality, and 2 blocks from school, Zara stopped walking, looked up at him with an expression that mixed childish uncertainty with uncomfortable wisdom. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Dante said, the word automatic after 10 days of learning that Zara's questions usually led places he hadn't expected to go. "Did you have a little sister?" Zara asked carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "Mama says you carry a sad that's shaped like someone small." The walls Dante had spent 15 years constructing around Katya's memory shattered like they were made of glass instead of the reinforced steel he'd believed was impenetrable. He hadn't spoken his sister's name in 15 years, hadn't acknowledged her existence to anyone, not even Nikolai, who'd been there through everything, not even his mother before she died, still grieving a daughter whose death her son had caused. "Yes," Dante heard himself say, his voice breaking around the truth he'd locked away. "Her name was Katya. She was your age when she died." Zara took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his like she was offering comfort to a man who'd forgotten how to receive it. "I'm sorry. That's the worst kind of sad." "It is," Dante confirmed, the words scraping out of his throat like they had been buried under rubble he'd spent decades piling on top of them. "Is that why you said yes?" Zara asked. "To walking me?" Dante's voice broke completely. "Yes." "Then she's still protecting kids," Zara said with the certainty of someone who'd just solved a puzzle adults had overcomplicated. "Through you. That's beautiful." Week 3 brought the threat Dante had known was inevitable the moment he'd said yes to walking an 8-year-old to school, the moment he'd allowed vulnerability to crack through the armor he'd spent 25 years forging from other people's fear. A rival organization, the Bratva Syndicate that had been testing his territory boundaries for months, learned about his pattern, saw the most feared man in Chicago walking a black child to school every morning at 7:45 sharp, and recognized opportunity disguised as weakness. They sent a message through channels designed to reach Dante without leaving evidence. "Stop walking the kid or we make her the message." Same playbook that had killed Katya 15 years ago. Same strategy that had taught Dante that loving anything made you vulnerable to men who weaponized love against you. His men gathered in his office within an hour, Nikolai leading the argument that everyone knew needed to be made, even though no one wanted to speak it. "Boss, this is too much risk. You need to stop. Send someone else or end it entirely before they follow through." Dante's response was immediate, cold, final. "Then we end them." Nikolai, who'd been with Dante through 15 years of strategic violence and calculated escalation, actually hesitated before speaking the truth that needed saying. "Boss, going to war over a cleaning lady's kid," he started, but didn't finish because Dante stood up with the particular stillness that preceded eruptions. "Her name is Zara. And yes, war." But Dante didn't start a war. He did something more shocking, something that confused his organization more than violence ever could have. He went to Zara's elementary school, sat in the principal's cramped office with its motivational posters and student artwork, and offered to fund comprehensive security for the entire school through an anonymous donation that couldn't be traced back to him or his empire. $500,000 for cameras, professional security guards, safe route programs, panic buttons in every classroom. Enough to protect not just Zara, but every vulnerable child in a building full of kids whose parents couldn't afford private school security or gated community protection. The principal, a woman named Margaret Chen, who'd spent 20 years watching underfunded public schools fail children who deserved better, stared at him with suspicion and desperate hope warring across her features. Why, she asked, the single word carrying decades of learning that generosity always came with strings. Because I can, Dante replied, which was true but incomplete. Because one child asked me for help, and I remembered what it cost when I couldn't help the last one. The confrontation with Isabel came that evening, after she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that had better intelligence networks than most police departments that her employer, the man she cleaned blood for, had put a target on her daughter by making Zara's safety his personal concern. She found him in his office, dismissed his men with a look that said this conversation would happen regardless of security protocols or proper channels. "You've put a target on my daughter," Isabel said, her voice carrying the particular fury of mothers whose children are threatened by circumstances beyond their control. Dante met her eyes without flinching, without the deflection or manipulation he used on everyone else. "I've made her untouchable. No one will touch her without declaring war on me. And I win wars." "Why?" Isabel demanded, the same question the principal had asked, the question Dante had been avoiding answering honestly even to himself. Why risk everything for us? The truth came out rough, scraped from places Dante hadn't examined in 15 years, words that felt like confessing crimes he'd been convicted of decades ago but never served time for. Because 15 years ago, I was building what I am now, and my sister Katya paid the price. She was 8 years old. Rival gang killed her to send me a message, left her body on my mother's doorstep to teach me that power makes you vulnerable, that loving anything gives your enemies ammunition. And I've spent 15 years becoming the monster they created, making myself so dangerous that no one would ever dare take from me again. But your daughter walked into my office and asked me to walk her to school, and I remembered who I was before I became this. When someone small was depending on me and I failed. I can't fail again. Isabel's anger didn't soften so much as refocus itself into something more complex, something that mixed fury with understanding, with the exhausted pragmatism of single mothers who survive by recognizing useful allies, even when they come wrapped in violence. "You're using my daughter to absolve yourself," she said, the accusation landing exactly where Dante knew it would, because she was right. "Yes," he confirmed, meeting her eyes, "and to protect her. Both can be true." Isabel's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, the armor of competence she wore to survive her circumstances cracking just enough to show the mother underneath. "She talks about you like you're a hero." "I'm not," Dante replied with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was. "But maybe I can be different for her than I was for Katya. Maybe that's the best I can do with what I've become." The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly, the way reputation shifts when powerful men do unexpected things. Dante continued walking Zara every morning, 7:45 sharp, but now other kids started joining them. First one, a boy from Zara's class whose mother worked nights and couldn't walk him to school. Then, 2 more, siblings whose father had been deported and whose grandmother was too old to make the trip safely. Then, 5. Then, 12. Parents noticed that the safest route to school in the neighborhood was wherever Dante Volkov walked, that the most feared man in Chicago running a volunteer school escort meant their children made it to class without harassment, without threats, without the background violence that turned education into survival training. He didn't advertise it, didn't publicize it, just showed up every morning in his $1,000 suit with 12 kids trailing behind him like he was the Pied Piper of Chicago's South Side, except instead of leading children away, he was leading them to safety. The rival organization made their move 3 weeks later, proving that some people never learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one protecting something they love more than they fear death. They sent men to ambush the morning walk, 6 armed enforcers who thought overwhelming force against one man would send the message their earlier threat had failed to deliver. What they found instead was Dante surrounded by 12 children, 6 parents who'd started accompanying the walk, and 3 police officers Dante had called himself for witness protection, creating a scene so public and so innocent that violence became impossible without harming exactly the people the Bratva claimed they only targeted strategically. Dante's message was delivered in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, clear enough that no one could misunderstand. You want war? Fight me. Not them. Come at me directly or admit you're too afraid to face someone who can fight back. The unexpected resolution came not through violence, but through something Dante had never considered using his resources for: creation instead of destruction. He established Safe Walk Chicago as a formal program, funding it with money laundered clean through legitimate channels, hiring ex-gang members as paid escorts and giving them legal work that didn't require them to choose between poverty and crime. He walked Zara himself every morning, 7:45 sharp like clockwork, then handed her off to the program's escorts for the afternoon pickup. His reputation shifted in ways that confused his enemies and made his allies nervous because Dante Volkov was still dangerous, still feared, still ran his empire with ruthless efficiency and strategic brutality. But now everyone knew that children in his territory were untouchable, that the man who'd built an empire on making people afraid had drawn a line around innocence and dared anyone to cross it. 6 months later, Zara's elementary school was the safest in the district, with 47 kids using the Safe Walk program daily, and crime statistics dropping so dramatically that city officials took credit for community initiatives they'd had nothing to do with. Dante still walked Zara personally every morning, 7:45 sharp, a routine that had become as fundamental to his day as the illegal enterprise that paid for everything else. She called him Mr. Dante now, the formality softening into something that felt like family without quite naming itself that way. He kept every drawing she gave him, 23 of them now, displayed in his office between contracts and territory maps, like evidence that something other than violence could mark his legacy. Katya's photo sat beside them, no longer hidden behind credit cards, but present, acknowledged, honored through the protection he gave to children she would have been if the world had been different, if Dante had been different, if violence hadn't taken her before he learned that. Power without protection was just another word for the thing that killed people he loved. Zara's 9th birthday brought the final moment that defined what they'd become to each other. Dante showed up at the small party Isabel had thrown in their apartment, the first time he'd been in their home, the first time he'd allowed himself to be present in their private life, instead of just the morning walks that lived in public space. He brought a gift wrapped in paper Nikolai had helped him choose, because Dante had no idea what 9-year-old girls wanted. Inside was a backpack, child-sized, decorated with the same cartoon characters that covered Zara's current bag, but lined with bulletproof material, disguised so completely that no one would know they were looking at armor designed to stop the violence Dante knew too much about. Zara hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his waist, her voice muffled against his expensive suit. "Thank you for keeping your promise." "I'll always show up," Dante said, his voice rough around the edges. "That's what you taught me matters." Isabel watched from across the room, tears tracking down her face, and Dante met her eyes over her daughter's head. "I can't bring Katya back," he said quietly, the confession carrying across the space between them. "But I can make sure no 8-year-old in this city dies because men like me exist. I can make sure that the violence I create doesn't splash onto children who deserve better than the world we've built. It won't absolve me, it won't make me good, but maybe it means Katya's death created something other than the monster that got her killed." Dante Volkov didn't stop being dangerous. He didn't stop running his empire or making enemies or doing things that made saints weep and prosecutors build cases they'd never successfully prosecute. But one 8-year-old girl who asked him to walk her to school taught him something he'd spent 25 years refusing to learn. That power without protection is just violence. That fear without purpose is just cruelty. That men built from brutality can choose to be gentle when someone small enough asks, not because gentleness makes them weak, but because sometimes the strongest thing a dangerous man can do is refuse to let his violence define everything he touches. Sometimes the scariest men are the ones who choose to be gentle, not because they can't be monsters, but because someone small asked them to be better, and they remembered when they'd been asked before and failed, and decided that maybe this time, this child, this chance to protect instead of destroy, was worth risking everything they'd built on being feared. Sometimes we forget that the people who need protection most are the ones asking those least likely to help. Have you ever asked for help from someone unexpected and found they showed up when no one else would, found they became exactly what you needed despite everything suggesting they'd fail you? Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes the difference between violence and protection is just someone small enough asking someone dangerous enough to choose differently.